Well, welcome everybody to Module 2, Lecture 2, The Evolution of Air Freight Transport. Our focus questions this week are: how is the air freight industry evolved over time, or how has the air freight industry evolved over time? What are the licensing and regulations that govern air cargo transport? What are the economic and financial considerations in relation to air cargo transport? What are the freedoms of air? And how do air service agreements influence the movement of air cargo? So quite a bit to get through today. Our readings are centred around sales, Morel and Wensveen. And I guess any discussion about where aviation started from would probably have to have a photograph or some form of reference to the first acknowledged air flight. And this was the first picture of that taken of the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, back there in 1903. And this was the first powered, controlled flight of its type, and we can see them here. The aircraft itself didn't really get that high above the ground. This was the first of 4 attempts. You can see Orville at the controls and Wilbur at the side. He was actually steadying the aircraft as it got going. First attempt was around about 80 yards until the last one was around about 800. So it was a sort of a significant event for aviation at the time. A couple of years later, they'd completed their first aircraft, manufactured their first aircraft for use. When it comes to air cargo, there's a number of people putting up their hand to suggest that they were the first people to take some form of air cargo. There was one of the Wright brothers' planes actually carried an amount of silk in Ohio, and however, the earliest reported scheduled air cargo movements, and we're talking about scheduled, was airmail in 1911, and this was from a pilot by the name of Earl Ivington. You can see him there in the photograph, with a couple of the local dignitaries about to set off from Long Island to Mineola Post Office. Over time, some 37,000 pieces of mail were actually delivered on that route. Now, of course, the aviation and as aviation was evolving, there was a lot happening in Europe, particularly France and Germany. And around about that same time, a shipment of newspapers were moved by a biplane from a chap by the name of Sigrid Hoffman, and that arrived ahead of the usual schedule by rail, and in many ways confirming the promise offered by air cargo transport. Now, when it comes to aircraft, excuse me, around about that period of time, there were also other forms of airships, and this is an example of one here. This is a German aircraft, the Zeppelin. And when it comes to passenger service, it's accepted that this was most likely the first commercially successful passenger-carrying aircraft. And over a period of a year, it undertook around about 200 and over 200 flights and transported over 1,500 passengers. So quite successful in its own right. Looking at the time, 1911, 1912, it was actually really a time of that was leading up to a significant event, which was World War I. And as it turned out, quite a number of the militaries of various countries have taken a lot of interest in your typical type of aircraft. So we can get a bit of a sense of, around about that 1914, 1915, 1916, the size and shape of the aircrafts. Many of these aircrafts, particularly the ones that you see on the screen, were used in World War One, fitted with forms of guns, as well as the capability in the bottom right-hand corner to drop bombs. So that period from 1914 to 1918, which was World War One, didn't see a lot of change in regards to civil aviation. However, it certainly confirmed in a lot of mind the potential for the aircraft for all manner of options. Coming out of World War One, obviously it was a period, particularly in Europe, of great death and destruction. It did have the effect to accelerate the progress of civil aviation, as some of these events can do. There was a lot of work in the manufacture of aircraft to participate in the war. So at the end of the war, there was actually quite an increased availability of aircraft. One of those planes from the Fokker flame, over 3,000 of those particular aircraft were manufactured. So the manufacturing facilities and the capabilities for doing that was certainly ramped up during that particular period of time. In addition to that, from a base of around about 2,000 pilots, that multiplied quite considerably. And by the end of the war, there was thousands of pilots available. So a large pool of pilots to facilitate any increase in the aviation industry, whether it was along passenger lines or whether it was along cargo lines. And I suppose it's fair to say that that proof of concept of air transport as a valuable means was certainly accepted, and secure investment to move the industry along certainly wasn't too far away. That said, it was, I guess, there were some barriers in place. There were some challenges at this particular point in time. Excuse me. Despite that increased availability, military aircraft themselves were fit for purpose. They were fit for going into combat. They weren't really fit for, so there was not a lot of creature comfort, so to speak. So they weren't fit for necessarily taking passengers or other type of activities. Yes, there was the potential to take a small amount of cargo. So they required significant servicing to keep them going, and also a fair amount of modification to make them appropriate for civil aviation. In addition to this, the supporting infrastructure for aircraft was very limited. Few landing strips, few connecting roads, few terminals, and the infrastructure was in its infancy. So that was sort of holding back civil aviation. In addition to this, it was still quite an expensive pastime. So only few people could afford it if they could. And so there was any lack of economies of scale which would bring the price down and present opportunities for a greater number of customers, which ultimately would lead to some form of profitability. And probably something that, particularly in regards to the internationalisation of civil aviation, which was holding it back, was this idea of a framework of laws and regulations as aircraft moved from one airspace to another. So, over the ensuing decade, a significant number of milestones, albeit slowly if you like, were occurring. During this time, a number of airlines were forming, taking advantage of the opportunity to move passengers, mail or freight. The first of those, KLM, I think it was 1918 or 1919, they were founders, and they're the oldest continuing airline in the world. Yes, they amalgamated with Air France in 2004, but they do remain the oldest airline in the world. Qantas weren't very far behind them. So the Flying Kangaroo came in around about 2020 and 1920, sorry, so that places them at the second oldest continuous airline in the world, third overall. So some firsts were coming along during this period of time. The first mail and freight only service was operated in France, and that's regarded as the first all-cargo service. When freighters, so all cargo, we're talking about freighter aircraft, and when the freighter aircraft were introduced for the first time, they were using a tariff based on volume and weight, which is actually still in use today. One of the milestones along the way was the ability to fly at night. That milestone was ticked off by German airline Deutsche Lufthansa when they established the first night flight route in around about 1926. Over this post-war period, a number of advances were occurring in the United States. The United States, the viability of air freight did improve quite considerably when they introduced night flights, particularly for air freight. Another milestone was, particularly for air cargo, was the first scheduled postal route, international postal route, between Germany and South America, once again by Deutsche Lufthansa in 1934. Freight traffic and long-haul routes were actually really quite modest, particularly for freight, although KLM and Deutsche Lufthansa were exceptions, and they carried a variety of items, even including animals. As I said before, as we moved in post the World War I, one of the aspects which were holding civil aviation behind was this lack of regulation. So what we saw through the 1920s was there a number of pivotal conventions were held to discuss openly between countries this idea of moving from one airspace to another. First significant one was the Paris International Air Convention, or the Paris Convention if you like, in 1922. And this focused on this idea of sovereign control of national airspace. And the principle was discussed along the lines that any country has got the legal right to control whatever happens above in its airspace, in its own national airspace. So it's got sovereign control over that. Side by side, that principle was this freedom of air over a country's airspace was admitted, in that an acceptance that flights from other countries would need to move into other people's airspace, and there should be a general agreement around that, that was something that could happen. In addition to that, there was quite a number of topics were thrashed out at that particular event. 9 separate charters, so 9 volumes of work covering rules and regulations and standards and protocols, covering things such as the nationality of the aircraft, the airworthiness of the aircraft, patents for aircraft, and also this idea of a permission to land in one country and also take off in another country. So quite a considerable amount of work was done. Of course, if you look at the time, 1922, only 4 years after the First War, there was still a number of simmering hostilities or animosities, if you like, and a number of countries didn't participate in that particular event. Most notably Germany. They may not have even been given an invitation, I'm not too sure about that. Soviet Union, China, and interestingly the United States. In many ways, the Paris International Air Convention was convened by the Allies, the victors of World War I, and the United States, despite their President Woodrow Wilson encouraging them to participate, he couldn't convince his Senate to be part of this particular activity. So, as the US can do from time to time, they went off and they had their own convention in 1928, which is known as the Havana Convention. They spoke on about a lot of the other topics that were brought up at the Paris Convention, and they just focused on countries in their region, so South America, Latin America, and it was talking about the movement of, or the growth of aviation at that point in time. The next significant convention was soon after, and another one of those conventions that still has resonance today, and this was the Warsaw Convention. Now, the approach on the Warsaw Convention was somewhat different than the Paris Convention. This was more focused on issues around liability, who's culpable for accidents, who's got the legal standing in certain situations, particularly over persons, luggage and cargo. Also, in addition to this, a number of key terms in regards to aviation were discussed. Things along the lines of the definition of what international carriage actually meant. It also defined rules regarding documentation and legal jurisdiction, as I mentioned before, but it also spoke about some of those punitive sanctions that might occur should an accident or some form of liability happen. This convention remains binding for 152 states, so 152 countries signed up to this particular convention. There have been iterations over time. I think the most, quite a number over time, but it's still quite important work. So in between that period of the 1930s, just going back a slide there, if you look at the time again, 1929, the world was on the cusp of the Great Depression. It was the most significant downturn in the economy that the modern era had ever faced. So this particular period of time was really a difficult time for many countries, certainly not a great deal of entrepreneurship. The United States was particularly devastated, as were other countries around the globe. And so this led into that period of the 1930s, and the rise of Germany again, and the start of World War II in 1939. So once again, a war got in the way of, I suppose, the advancement of civil aviation. Certainly a lot of work was done in regards to the war effort, and all the efforts were put into that. A significant event occurred after the war. So after World War II, the Allies divided up Germany. France, Britain, the USSR and the US, they controlled Germany. I guess one of the issues there was you've got four highly weaponised countries all doing their best to work together with quite different ideologies, really. And this alliance held until about 1948, when the USSR weren't really happy with the direction that Germany was being taken, and decided to block off some sectors of Berlin which were under Western control. Effectively what they were doing, they were cutting off the city to food and supplies. Now obviously it's quite a volatile type of situation, and nobody really wanted any form of conflict. So in response to this, US and Britain decided to fly in supplies and food and fuel to keep the part of the city. And they did this for a period of 10 months, and it turned out to be the largest single humanitarian effort to date. And they delivered over that period, not even 12 months, 2 million tonnes of supplies. So you've got this classical photo there of a Douglas Skytrain aircraft, I think, flying over the top, and the people of Berlin waiting on those supplies. And as I said, much of the reason for this issue had to do with this ideological and economic differences between what turned out to be the East and the West, really. Communism on one side and democracy on the other. And I suppose ultimately was the start of the Cold War. For air cargo, it was really a shot in the arm. It was a point in time where for the first occasion air freight was actually used to maximum effect. And the sheer magnitude of the airlift is quite considerable. We had about 260 aircraft moving a day, carrying about 8,000 tonnes of supplies. So this particular point in time has presented a number of lessons for the air cargo industry, which would go on to benefit for decades to come. Just to give you a sense of the type of aircrafts that were available around about that period of time, as you can see, a lot more robust. They're looking a lot more like the aircraft that we know today. And a number of these aircraft, particularly the Douglas Skytrain, were able to make that transition into civil aviation post-World War II. At the end of, or near the end of World War II, civil aviation was on the cusp. International flights had grown to a point where some form of global legal network was required. And it was really essential to have that agreement between countries for civil aviation to move forward. As I said before, we know that during the period of the 1920s, we had some very significant and meaningful gatherings, the Paris and Warsaw Conventions, for example. However, more regulation was required to support passenger and cargo movement. Of course, if you had a scorecard, if you like, of the progression of air cargo in those first 40 or so years, you'd probably give it a fail grade. It didn't really hit great heights. So the air cargo would only benefit from an improvement of around regulation, because over this first 40 years it was really restricted to domestic activity and a few international routes. So in a conference in 1944, attended by 54 countries, provided this forum to establish a global legal framework. And this framework is still in use today. Yes, there's been modifications again today, but this framework presents the uniformity for civil aviation as we know it today. Excuse me. So the outcome of this particular conference was the framing of a set of around about 15 annexes and other documents which covered the technical economic aspects and were enshrined as what we've come to be known as the Chicago Convention. This convention, as I mentioned last week, is administered and managed by the International Civil Aviation Organisation. So it's been in place, if we look at the date 1944, so it's around about 75 years. In fact, it's its 75th anniversary this year. The Chicago Convention, as I said, consisted of 15 significant areas of discussion, 15 annexes if you like, and the detail was based around standards and recommended practices that countries could adopt. And if countries adopted this, then there would be a level of uniformity around the globe. Since that initial 15 annexes, it's grown over time by an additional 4 at various forums and conferences that have convened over time. And in particular, these last four, all of them have relevance to air cargo, but the last four have particular relevance to air cargo, particularly Annex number 18, which spoke about the safe transport of dangerous goods by air. And this was influenced quite significantly by terrorism and also batteries and other types of goods that were being carried on aircraft. The other annex of particular interest or influence to air cargo was around safety management, and that's been in place since about 2013. Now, one of the challenges with additional regulation of air cargo, as it is with passengers, what we've seen over the last 40 years is a significant increase in trade. All customs agencies are working more to freeing up the movement of passengers and cargo as it goes through terminals. So when you start putting regulations on that, it's actually a challenge to actually have that efficient and effective movement, a trade facilitation, if you like, through the various customs agencies. And some countries are going to be better than that than the other. However, that said, 9/11 and other terrorist attacks have significantly influenced the regulation in regards particularly the movement of air cargo. And the biggest challenge, as I said before, is to keep the movement of goods through that border. And the way that agencies and authorities have approached this is to find a method of doing all the screening of goods at the airport. So finding another approach to do that. And the way that they've tackled this is by undertaking significant amounts of screening of the air cargo before it gets to the airport. And the only way that they could really do this is by authorising particular entities outside the government regulatory bodies, if you like, to take those security and safety and implement those within their own business. So what we found, USA took the lead, followed by Europe. Australia's on board. So they're now authorising parties such as agents, freight forwarders and consignors to perform pre-shipment security control. So they're authorising them to take the responsibility that agencies, customs and other authorities were taking to defray the bottleneck at the airport. So what I've got here is an example of how Australia has taken those standards and recommended practices in the Chicago Convention and put them into legislation here in Australia. So the example that I've got is when last year the Australian government announced that it was going to strengthen domestic and international aviation security. And they had a range of measures which came in place 4 or 5 months ago on the 1st of March. And that change in regulation was that every piece of cargo, every single piece of cargo will need to comply with safety measures before it's loaded onto the aircraft. So effectively what they're saying here is that 100% piece screening of air cargo would need to be undertaken. Now, this is not completely new for Australia and also the businesses that move cargo through airports, because we've been doing here in Australia since, for a couple of years, since July 2017. But that really only accounted for 5% of cargo that was going to the United States. So what the authorities in Australia said was, we're now upping that to 100%. So 95% of more cargo was going to be reviewed at that particular period of time. and of course those people who are moving air cargo through the airport, particularly, and we're talking about internationally, were also warned that delays were going to be experienced. The current situation is that all outbound air cargo exported from Australia will need to be examined. Now, they need to be examined by a number of parties. The first party could be a regulated air cargo agent with an enhanced air cargo examination notice, which is effectively with knowledge of the protocol on security and safety. So that's the first part. And the second part, it could be exported out of Australia if you're a known consigner. So two different groups here. The first one, the regulated air cargo agent, is a scheme for businesses such as those that handle and make arrangements to transport outbound international air cargo. Also, examine and clear international air cargo under the EACE notice. So what we're talking about here, we're talking about most likely third-party logistics operators. We're talking about freight forwarders with also interests in providing additional services. So this was the process for so that those parties, such as a freight forwarder or a logistics operator, could take up that particular scheme and facilitate that role. And if you think about it, if you're a service provider in the logistics industry, and this is something that a rule that has to occur, if you're passing that on to somebody else to do that on your behalf, it's got the potential to slow the movement of goods through the supply chain. And as we know, one of the real pluses of air cargo and the movement of air cargo by air is this idea of speed. So this gives the freight forwarders, it gives the third-party logistics operator the control over the movement of those goods. Now, the expectations of any freight forwarder or third-party logistics operator is that they comply with the scheme. Well, I suppose that's a given. The scheme itself is administered by the DHA, or the Department of Home Affairs. They are required to examine and clear international cargo, another requirement of being a regulated air cargo agent. They also need to protect the security of the cargo for all the time before it leaves its possession, and issue a security declaration that these goods have been examined and cleared consistent with the protocols laid down by the department. And in doing so, they need to ensure that all their staff are aware of the program and adhere to the guidelines. And they must also be prepared for some form of compliance test if it comes along from the Department of Home Affairs. Now, there is a fallback option for a business perhaps who doesn't want to do the clearance side of things, or is a business, most likely an agent, perhaps a freight forwarder, who just handles and makes arrangement for transport, which sounds very much like a freight forwarder. They can have buy into another scheme that allows them to do that before they then pass on to somebody else to examine and clear the international air cargo. Now, the known consigner scheme has been really introduced to streamline the way goods are cleared for export in Australia. So this is another option open particularly to as an alternative to the regulated air cargo agent. So known consigners is focused particularly at businesses involved in export, and they need to adhere to the protocols to keep excuse me, to maintain the high level, the security of cargo before it is loaded onto the aircraft. So they also, as has the regulated air cargo agent, have to have security measures and procedures in place during the entire time those goods are in their possession before they pass those goods on to another regulated business. Now, known consignors have to meet similar rules and regulations as do the regulated air cargo agent. What they need to do is, one, they need to buy into the program and be aware of all the rules and regulations. They also need to take that ownership of the air cargo and that it originates in their business until it leaves. So undertake the some form of issue of proof that while the goods are in their possession, they are secure and safe, and also they need to issue proof that the cargo itself is really cleared of any particular issues. So that gives people further down the line the confidence that they've met all the rules and regulations. Employees need to be right across that, so employees working in that exporting business need to have security awareness training, and also, as has the regulated air cargo agent, they also have to have and be aware that they might be periodic checks from the Department of Home Affairs. Now, to be eligible as a known consignor, as you can see, it's subtly different from the regulated air cargo agent. This is really designed for the exporter. So it's a business that's very close to the export of cargo by air. They should have an ABN. They should originate the cargo, and they need to know what's in every box, every carton, and also need to meet one of the following requirements. And the first one is that they are the business that makes, manufactures and assembles and otherwise produces those goods to be moved for export. And that could be any business that takes a series of parts, brings it into their position and finalises the final manufacture, the final assembly of those goods. It could be a primary industry, it could be a business that is taking some form of primary industry and manufacturing that into a final product. So it could be that type of business, or it could be the owner, or it could be a business or owner in control of the goods when they become ready for export. The business might package the goods in boxes and cartons, so they might be more of a consolidator, if you like. So there's a number of different options there. One of the, I suppose, positive aspects of this new scheme is that it's very consistent with an already existing and successful scheme called Australian Trusted Trader. So many existing exporters from Australia are part of what's called the Australian Trusted Trader scheme. And that presents the business with an opportunity to streamline their process of export and reduce red tape. And ultimately, the reduction of red tape through a form of acknowledgement between customs and the exporter is going to enhance the movement of those goods in and out of Australia, which means faster access to the market. So that's the example I wanted to show in that particular regard. Now, when it comes to the Chicago Convention, that gives you a sense, that particular table, of all the annexes or all the areas of interest that the Chicago Convention focuses on. There are 19 annexes, as I said. Started off with 15 and some additional ones have been added. And at this point in time, once that information has been signed up by the various countries, it's certainly not law or legislation that has to come later. So the various countries have to go back to their own parliaments, and they have to enshrine that in some form of legislation so it becomes law, and then it's got to be implemented by a range of different bodies. So from Australia's perspective, the Chicago Convention is spread by a number of the responsible Australian regulatory bodies, such as civil aviation, and they look after, for example, Annex 1, Annex 2, Annex 6, 7 and 8, Annex 14 and Annex 18 and 19. Air Services Australia, they look after a number of annexes. The Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Cities and Regional Development look after a number of areas as well. And also there's some composite Air Services Australian, CASA, also work on some together. I mean, ultimately all of these authorities are working very closely to each other, so they share information. Essentially that's how these type of rules and regulations which are embodied in these global conventions are spread out through the various countries. So the same thing that happens here in Australia would be happening in the United States, would be happening also in the UK, for example. So the previous example that about air cargo and the 100% screening is just an example of how a country will take the rules and regulations of that global agreement and put them into legislation. And I guess one of the beauties of this particular legislation is the fact that you get a level of uniformity from country to country to country. So when it comes to something like licensing of airlines, you're going to find that the approach taken by most countries are going to be really quite similar. However, the enshrining of these rules and regulations and standards and recommended practices can vary from country to country. The example I've got here is the UK. So what you would find is the approach to licensing in the UK is going to be similar to Australia, it's going to be similar to other countries, just depending on their approach to this idea of open skies. So if you're a UK airline and you want an operating licence, you have to go through a particular process. You've got to apply for the relevant licences, you've got to secure an air operator certificate, and you've got to place your aircraft on a register with the Civil Aviation Authority. One of the interesting characteristics of the UK is, at the moment, it's part of the European Union. The European Union back in 2007 stated that if you've got a licence in any country that's part of the European Economic Area, which is their designated area for aviation, then you don't have to apply for a licence in another country. So it's actually a major benefit from being part of the European Union. So as we move into something like Brexit in another 99 days, there's certainly going to be having some significant discussions around this idea of air access and whether the UK can continue to have that same benefits applied to it as it leaves the European Union, with a deal or no deal. So there could be some quite considerable ramifications. So the granting of the operating licence requires the airline to undertake a number of things. Firstly, it has to have its principal place of business in the country. It needs to be majority owned and controlled by a national of the state. And at this point in time, or in the case of Europe, nationals of any of those European economic areas. The airline needs to have sufficient financial resources to be able to demonstrate that. Also, it has to have the necessary insurances to cover accidents involving passengers, cargo and third-party carriers. As well as that, they have to have an air operator's certificate in conformance with Annex 6 of the Chicago Convention. Now, that's going to get you to that's going to get you on the tarmac, but you're not able to fly at this point in time. To do this, you actually need a route licence, and that's another form of licences that the airline needs to get. The thing about the route licence, it's a key aspect to gaining that operating licence, and it gives you the opportunity to move beyond your own country into other airspace. And some countries deal with that differently. Some have a licence for those airlines that want to have a scheduled departure or a charter departure. It just depends, or a combination of both. It's got a number of applications, but primarily it's designed to cover the do's and don'ts on whatever route that you're seeking to take advantage of. So what the restrictions are on that route, so it might be how many departures on that particular route, and the sort of coverage, how many airports that you might be able to go to in that particular country. Prima facie, it enables those national airlines to access international routes that the country itself has negotiated. So if the authorities in your country has been very proactive and established a number of routes around the globe, that's going to benefit you. As new routes come up, the expectation is that you need to negotiate directly with your local authority. In the UK, it's the Civil Aviation Authority, because in many cases there might only be a limited number of spaces available on those routes, so it's not a given. This practice generally occurs when regulatory authorities negotiate with one country a new route or frequency. Now, of course, this need for some form of negotiation with regulatory authorities doesn't happen in the European Union because they've got effectively an open skies policy. So hearings are unnecessary. An interesting aspect of technical regulation is this idea that authorities at any time in any country can actually withdraw permission. So if you're an airline and your country has negotiated a route for you and you don't meet the international safety standards of that particular country, they can take that back. And the only option available to you immediately is to remedy that situation in some way. Excuse me. Now, you've got a number of countries will have a list of carriers that are subject to a ban. They're banned from operating to and from particular areas. The EU has got a safety list. And if we look back on 2017, their blacklist for airlines operating passenger and freighter flights covered a range of different countries there. So the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Iraq, to Zimbabwe. So that placed those countries with a significant dilemma if they wanted to continue to do business in the European Union. One of the options available to countries in that particular scenario is this idea of leasing. So leasing presents an opportunity for an airline in one country to operate aircraft that's registered in another country. And one of the largest leasing airlines in the world is called Atlas Air. They've got a number of subsidiaries and they have about 120 aircraft that they lease out on a short-term basis usually for airlines who want to utilise their aircraft. Now, if you do decide to go down that track and undertake leasing, it can come in a number of different shapes and forms. One of them is commonly referred to as a wet lease, or an ACMI. ACMI being an acronym for Aircraft, Crew, Maintenance and Insurance. So in other words, a company like Atlas Air was providing the aircraft, the crew, the maintenance and insurance, and maintained in other countries. And that would most likely be enough to enable that particular airline to continue flying into those particular regions. There's a number of pros of this particular approach. Well, first and foremost, if you're on a ban list, this might be an opportunity for you. I guess that stands out as one. It also presents opportunities if you're moving into a peak season. It looks like you're going to need some aircraft. Leasing could be one of those options available to you, a short-term option, because the alternative might be that you might actually have to purchase a new or used aircraft. Alternatively, all aircraft go through cycles of maintenance, and if it's temporarily grounded, rather than suffer not having additional aircraft in your fleet, you could lease it. Alternative to the outright purchase of a new or converted aircraft, it could be that you're going through a process which it would be quite an exhaustive process just to work out what would work better for you. You need a short-term fix, so the wet lease or ACMI is going to work in your favour. In terms of a con of a wet lease, one of the issues around that is that it attracts a significant amount of regulatory interest, particularly around safety regulations. So you're going to have the fine focus of the authorities on that particular airline. Obviously, reputed leases of such as Atlas Air are going to pass through with flying colours, but there's a number of airlines that offer that service that the expectation of the particular country could be that they're not happy with the standards being fulfilled by that leasing company. So usually it's a short-term fix. Other options are any part of an ACMI. You could just provide the aircraft, for example, to lease. You could just provide the crew, or the crew, the maintenance, insurance. So it could be any mix if you like. Dry leasing is typically this option where you lease the aircraft only. And look, just finally here, just a discussion in regards to UAVs and unmanned aerial aircraft and drones. They've certainly come up on the radar over the last 5 or 10 years, and there's been widespread interest in this, particularly commercial interest. But it is one area where the authorities have taken significant steps to ensure that there's a lot of rigour around the rules and regulations. And we've had that case late last year in Gatwick, where a number of drones were straying into protected airspace around and disrupting air traffic. So that's a particular issue that wants to be avoided. Also, as I said, it's attracting a fair bit of commercial interest. Amazon, the integrators such as FedEx, have been considering the use of drones for a number of years now, to integrate it into their door-to-door delivery networks. Amazon Prime, for example, have been looking at this idea of within a 10-kilometre radius of their fulfilment centres to have a 30-minute delivery time. Currently, the FFA in the United States, they do permit drones. However, they've got some limits in terms of weight and payload of 55 pounds. And I guess the issue here is that it's going to continue to attract interest, particularly as payloads and range increases. And the FAA, for example, have already implemented bans at particular parts of the US, so drones can't be used in national parks, for example. And that's a response to the assuming that the noise and the ambience of national parks being disrupted by this type of activity. Right. Now, I've spoken in a fair bit of detail about the Chicago Convention and the fact that the various annexes were developed at that particular period of time. There are two other significant documents that were developed at the time, and the first one is what's called the Two Freedoms Agreement. The real name is the International Air Services Transit Agreement, but simply stated it's the Two Freedom Agreement. And the Two Freedom Agreement was this idea that all the parties, all the countries that attended the Chicago Convention should grant every other country a number of freedoms of air for their scheduled international services. Effectively, what they were saying here is that all countries should grant other countries the privilege of flying across its territory without landing, and the other privilege of landing for non-traffic purposes. So, because these were, I suppose, those rudimentary options for agreements between countries, that was something that should be a given. In addition to that, there was another document titled the International Air Transport Agreement, commonly referred to as the Five Freedoms Agreement, that provided a number of other privileges. Privilege of putting down passengers, mail and cargo, in the territory or state of whose nationality the aircraft possesses, taken on in the territory or state whose nationality the aircraft possesses. The privilege of picking up passengers, mail and cargo destined for a territory of a state whose nationality the aircraft possesses. The privilege of picking up passengers, mail and cargo destined for the territory of any other contracting state. And the privilege of putting down passengers, mail and cargo coming from any such territory. So effectively, this idea of opening up the skies to all the countries that were participating at this particular conference. The rationale of this was that instead of having 54 countries have individual discussions with each other, if they were prepared to sign these documents, there's no need for any bilateral agreements in the conduct of air transportation. So a considerable leap of faith when you consider that a lot of countries around the table at that period of time had varying degrees of development. There were some underdeveloped countries, some emerging countries, there were some developed countries with a whole range of different capabilities at their hands and different responses to issues around safety, around security, around movement of people. So it was quite a considerable ask at that particular point in time. Now, we can look a little bit closer here and we can go through here, and I've got a visual representation of how that works. So the example on the first one, the first freedom would be Lufthansa Cargo, based in Germany, taking their cargo over Russia to China. So that's that first freedom, that freedom to fly over another country. The second one is this idea of being able to make a technical stop in another country, to make a stop. And an example of that could be that that German flight carrying the cargo en route to China stops in Russia, and they stop for some sort of technical issue, which could be fuel in many ways. The third freedom, based on this idea of being able to carry traffic from a home country to another country. And this example would be air cargo from Germany actually being delivered to China. So that's the third freedom. The fourth freedom dealt with the idea to carry traffic to the home country from another country. So once again, using the Lufthansa cargo example, this is air cargo being picked up in China. So this is the return leg, if you like, and taken back to Germany. Fifth freedom. Now, this one was carrying traffic between two countries by an airline of a third country that originates or ends in the airline's home country. So an example here is that air cargo from Germany taking that flight to China, dropping off cargo, perhaps picking up some cargo, and then continuing on to Australia and doing the same thing. So that's the fifth freedom. The sixth freedom being carrying traffic between two countries by an airline of a third country via the airline's own country. Now, an example of this would be Cargo Lux, they're an air cargo carrier. They're bringing air cargo. They start off in North America and they fly into their own hub back in Germany, and then they move on to Africa. So that's an example of a sixth freedom. A seventh freedom relates to carrying traffic between two countries by an airline of a third country and bypassing its own country. And this is a situation, excuse me, this is a situation where you have an airline and they've got a hub outside their own country. So, for example, DHL, the integrated DHL, they've got a regional hub in Bahrain in the Middle East, and they operate flights from that particular point. So they've got Boeing 727s, A300s, and other smaller freighter flights that move to and fro from that particular hub. So they're actually not, yet their country isn't involved in that particular process. So that's a seventh freedom. An eighth freedom is this idea of carrying traffic between two or more airports in a country on a service that originates in the airline's own country. So in this particular example, we've got Cathay Pacific. They're located in Hong Kong. They start off in their own country and they land in Atlanta, and they either pick up and drop off cargo there, and then they continue on to another part of the United States, let's say Dallas-Fort Worth. And that internal movement, so it's an intra-country flight, which is commonly, when it's by another airline, it's commonly known as cabotage. And the ninth freedom is similar to that particular scenario. It's carrying traffic between two or more airports in a foreign country on a service that originates in the foreign country. So you've got a foreign country. An example of this is that you've got a foreign airline who operates freely within a particular country. So Tiger Airlines is a foreign airline and they operate within the Australian airspace, and that's the ninth freedom. So this two freedoms of air, those first two options, the idea of flying over a country and the idea of dropping down, were really designed to minimise this idea of having these bilateral agreements. And it's generally accepted that that two freedoms agreement was widely accepted. Everybody was pretty comfortable with the idea that yes, you should be able to fly over other countries, and yes, if you do need to make an emergency stop, you should be able to do it. However, the Five Freedoms Agreement, a lot more rigour around that, a lot more expectations and requirements, was not supported by all countries, in particular the United States. And in fact, the UK, US and a number of other countries got together soon after the Chicago Convention in what got known as the Bermuda Agreement to actually put more detail and more rigour around the particular discussion on those 5 freedoms. They introduced a dispute resolution process and they put more detail in regards to the routes, the traffic flows, and in particular there was clauses in regards to the determination of rates, how much an airline could charge in that particular country. So ultimately, despite the good intentions of the 2nd and 5th freedoms, over the ensuing years, hundreds and hundreds of bilateral agreements were required between countries to ensure that the opportunity to move into other people's airspace was an opportunity for the countries involved. And when these countries and the authorities sat down at the table, the main issues that were covered were the number of carriers that could come into that particular country, the number of routes that the particular carriers could take advantage of, and also the government's role in approving fares. This was a particular stumbling block for the United States. For over 40 years, the United States had complete control over rate setting in its own country, and obviously something it wanted to continue. Today, most of the routes awarded in these bilateral agreements tend to be 3rd and 4th freedom rights, but there's a number of other freedom rights depending on that bilateral agreement. So since Chicago and Bermuda, there's been a proliferation of these bilateral agreements. As I said before, hundreds and hundreds, mainly because that document wasn't signed for probably all the right reasons. And I guess an interesting thing about it is most of these agreements start off with some discussion around the passengers. However, cargo still benefits from taking advantage of whatever concessions are awarded to passengers, whether it's a passenger aircraft or whether it's a freighter aircraft. So certainly in the early days, there were very few separate agreements for all cargo flights. An example of one was between US and Japan, a 1996 cargo agreement. I suppose it's fair to say that no 2 bilateral agreements are the same, but they do follow a similar template or a standard form, which dates back to Chicago and Bermuda. Over the decades, one of the biggest impetuses to the freedoms of the air and the bilateral agreements and the agreement by countries and the opening of open skies has been the deregulation of countries. And while being a laggard in a number of different ways, certainly the US has led the way in regards to its deregulation. Certainly a lot of work was done post 1977 when the United States deregulated its own airspace. And a year later, that was for air cargo and followed a year later for passengers. Deregulation in the European Union probably had to wait another 15 or 20 years to be completed in 1998. However, it was probably worth waiting for, because in that general agreement of deregulation, it was stated that all countries, all the 26, 28 countries that were part of the EU at the time, were provided with open skies policy so that all flights between countries could be treated as a domestic flight, not an international flight. So it was a big benefit for those particular countries. So we know that when it comes to cargo air rules, air traffic rules. In many ways, they've followed the lead taken by passenger flights. Also that, and that's mainly because of, I suppose, the volumes and the business models of many airlines are focused around the passenger, certainly around that time, but before deregulation. So more about the passenger markets, rather than cargo. So as I said before, few all-cargo bilateral agreements in those early days, but they still achieved the benefits of those bilateral agreements from passenger traffic rights. So in addition to this focus on third and fourth routes, a number of fifth freedom have been opening up for air cargo. In addition to this, carriers have been expanding their hub airports in their home of registration by combining two sets of freedoms to carry the sixth freedom traffic. As we know, particularly the integrators, but also other significant hubs like Hong Kong, utilise this idea of flights coming in, a further consolidation and movement onto other flights, and then moving on for long-haul flights. So what we can see here is that we've got the sixth freedom. It's this idea of carrying traffic from two countries by an airline of a third country via the airline's own country. So, as I say, flights coming into the home country where the hub is, and then flying out of that to another country. Okay, so just giving you a sense of bilateral agreements, and we can see in those early years here that the number of bilateral agreements you could count on on one hand, so to speak. So in those first 15 years from 1976, there's very little movement with particular interest on air cargo. However, that changed beyond 91. So from 91 to 2005, we saw all cargo agreements increasing from 5 to 46 there. And we also see clauses in all cargo go from 14 to 29. So that doubled in number. And also a significant jump in general air freedom rights. So as the years have gone on, there's been more focus on making air cargo easier for movement around the globe. As I said before, the United States undertook a significant amount of liberalisation of air cargo as a result of deregulation there, and you can see the particular areas there that had a significant amount of interest during that particular period of time. So the examples of deregulation were any licensed carrier could enter the US market, indirect carriers such as freight forwarders could charter their own flights, cargo rates no longer could be lodged, didn't have to be lodged with government or justified, which is a big jump, and also there was a honeymoon period, if you like, for existing carriers, grandfather rights for 1 year, before we saw an influx of new operators in the United States. Similar sort of scenario for the EU, they went a little bit further. National ownership replaced by EU ownership. Unrestricted third, fourth and fifth freedom rights. No restrictions on frequency, capacity and aircraft type. Complete rate setting freedom subject to regulatory intervention, and no distinction between regulatory and charter services. Due to the distances between countries, one interesting aspect of the liberalisation of air cargo in Europe was the fact that trucking was a significant element of it. Because of the relationship between the EU and the United States, they also spend a lot of time improving the open skies between those countries, and a number of concessions were provided, as you can see here. India, an interesting case, also adopted its own open skies, really to do something about its own aviation industry. And as we can see, they really opened it up by effectively putting out the welcome mat for any air cargo services that wanted to operate in India. Anybody coming to India had full control of cargo rates. They would also consider the idea of combination carriers in tandem with the freighters, and the approach was unilateral. They weren't expecting anything back, and this was a real positive outcome for India, as it turned out. And just to finish off, what we can see here is that APEC made some significant strides in regards to the opening up of its airspace, particularly around cargo. And that was really driven by this idea that passengers and cargo within for some countries didn't have airlines. So they needed the influx of trade, they needed the influx of passengers to make this work. So if you have a look here, cargo in the APEC region, in that trade group, has been traded on a par with passengers.